Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to this AI and refugees session. And thanks, first of all, to Women in AI Ethics and to Mia and her amazing team for organizing such an impressive event and recognizing the importance of this topic as well. So let me first introduce myself. My name is Branka and I'm a founder and executive director of AI for Peace. It's a think tank working at the intersection of AI and peace, human rights, sustainable development, and humanitarian action. And I worked for previous 12 years in international development and humanitarian field, reconciliation and peace building. And I was also working with refugees directly as part of refugee aid during so-called refugee crisis in 2016-17 with refugees who were coming from Middle East and North Africa. So this topic is very close to my heart. I am originally from Serbia, from Southeast Europe. I am currently living in California. I would not call myself an immigrant, more as a global citizen who is currently living in California. And it's such a pleasure to co-host this session with my colleague Merve. Merve, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. So this is Merve Hickok. I'm the founder of AIethicist.org. I'm honored to be on the organizing committee for this event and to be part of this amazing community of women pushing boundaries despite all obstacles, and love that I'm doing this session with Branka. I used to work for a multinational organization as a senior HR executive for 20 years. Like Mia, I served my time in multinationals and following my passions now. I'm an independent consultant, lecturer, and speaker focusing on increasing awareness on ethical implications of AI and building capacity for individuals and organizations. Why am I doing this session on refugees with Branka? Because my background is HR. I'm originally from Turkey. I'm an immigrant to US, now holding dual citizenship. Since 2014, Turkey has been the country hosting the largest number of refugees in the world with 3.6 million refugees. So I've seen the lives and struggles of the refugees, as well as the impact of policies and tools on their future, which led me to be involved in this work and relevant to this area. So I'm currently sitting as a board member at Northern Nevada International Center, which is under University of Reno. It is one of the top refugee resettlement agencies in the US, working with the State Department. That work leads me to see firsthand the impact of government policies as well on refugees, as well as global diplomacy. And I'm involved in there to make a change for better as much as I can.
Perfect. So Merve and I had many conversations on this topic, and instead of having this formal type of presentation, we intentionally decided to have this more as a dialogue and trying to bring to you some of our experiences in this field. And what we want to do in this session is to highlight some of the opportunities and some of the positive applications, but also show how even positive intentions can have unintended consequences. And we will show some of the risks that AI, algorithms, machine learning, or any related technology may pose to refugee rights and protection. So we want to emphasize some concrete AI ethical principles needed to protect refugees' rights and to mitigate the risks refugees face on a daily basis. And we just want to clarify that we were thinking when preparing this session to include immigrants and immigrants issues. However, at the end, we decided not to do that because this is such a huge topic and it deserves a separate conference, that's for sure, with all of the applications of AI for immigrants. So for this specific session, in order to use the maximum of time that we have, we want to concentrate on refugees. And we will cover this topic in a way from two angles, trying to see how AI is impacting directly refugees, but also how AI is impacting the work of people who are assisting refugees. So trying to look at this topic from the humanitarian sector and humanitarian aid. Having this in mind, Merve, tell us a bit more about why we are focusing on refugees today. Why is this such an important topic to tackle in a conference like this?
Yeah, so according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees data, there are about 80 million people around the world who have been forced to flee their homes. 26 million of those are refugees, 46 million internally displaced people, and 4 million asylum seekers. Out of those numbers, 40% of those are children, and 4.2 million are stateless. If you're involved in AI ethics, you might come across Hannah Arendt's work, a very visionary person, who suggested that the moment humans lack their own government and have to backfall on minimum rights, there is no authority left for them to protect them, and no institution willing to guarantee them. Yes, since her time, you have supranational organizations like UN, IOM, but we still have a long way to go in terms of real protections. And earlier we heard from Sita about data collection on marginalized communities. We just want to frame this, that what is at risk with refugees will be at risk for immigrants and minorities within a country. So it has bigger implications. So on that, Branka, do you want to walk us through some of the positive implications?
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for this intro, Merve, and emphasizing why this is such an important topic, although we don't see it maybe at this point so often mentioned in media. It's important for us to remember as AI community how this is still a relevant topic, and all of the numbers that you mentioned is exactly why we sometimes think in the direction of technologies as well. It's important for us to remember that behind all these numbers are people in need of urgent need of humanitarian assistance. And just to mention another number that can clarify this, so this number was 12 times greater, is 12 times greater today than it was only 15 years ago. And this number is getting bigger and bigger, and our ability to respond with aid is unfortunately becoming smaller. On top of that pandemic, it's impossible not to mention pandemic when we are organizing a conference at this moment, and the spread of COVID-19 is additionally hindering the aid community to respond to the needs of refugees. Just to remind ourselves that almost 90%, so 90% of the world's refugees live in developing countries. Not US, not UK, Australia, or Canada. As Merve mentioned at the beginning, Turkey is, and some other developing countries are actually the biggest hosts of refugees. So they are often the ones who are struggling anyhow to provide basic services to their citizens. So having this in mind, we see that this gap between humanitarian aid and the needs, growing need, is growing deeper and deeper. And this is exactly why we as a community are looking in the direction of AI, not as a silver bullet. So we are avoiding this trap of techno, or trying to avoid this trap of techno solutionism, and trying to find and to see, are there any positive applications? And there are several ways in which data can contribute to improving humanitarian aid. And I will mention some from my work, such as prevention and preparedness, and disaster and conflict response. So by using predictive analytics, forecasting, mapping the impact of past disasters, we can actually better understand the possible effects of an upcoming new disaster or catastrophe or crisis. And in this way, we can try to help governments and even international donors or humanitarian agencies to make better informed decisions and to prepare for early action. And just to give an example, for my previous work, this was an early warning and early action system utilizing big data, AI, and ML to predict the probability of extreme hunger happening with vulnerable populations, including refugees and IDPs. IDPs are internally displaced people who are still staying inside of the borders of their country, but are still fleeing war and conflict. So I was working with a team developing models to help identify areas with a high probability of famine or extreme hunger happening. And our team was using the power of AI and ML to try to enhance the accuracy of predictions as well as the speed. So when you are directly impacting the food security or the access to food of sometimes starving populations, you can imagine the risks that come with false negatives or false positives. And you can also imagine the risks of misuse and abuse. And this is something that we as a community need to have in mind. And just to clarify this through this example, so the very same algorithms that we were developing could have been misused by malicious actors. And those malicious actors are often governments themselves. So the same tools that we were using to prepare our humanitarian food delivery could have been used to target the population that is in need for food intentionally, to starve this population. And in fact, today, it's shocking, but today in 21st century, starvation is used as a tool of war. So this puts practitioners in a position to really balance this, the risk of misuse of big data against the risk of misuse. And this risk is even higher when we are talking about fragile populations. So we are not talking here only about algorithms deciding who gets a job or a loan, which is very important topic, of course, and our community is talking a lot about this, but we are actually talking about algorithms here that can decide who gets food and who ultimately survives. So we need to remind ourselves all the time about the complexity of these problems we are facing here, not only problems that Western countries are facing when hosting refugees and reallocating refugees, but problems where the majority of refugees in countries where majority of refugees are actually based, developing countries. So the complex humanitarian problems demand careful analysis and consideration of both intended and unintended consequences. And thinking now again about these unintended or even negative consequences of AI, Merve, would you like to share with us some of these risks and negative consequences, and even point to some principles that we need to take into consideration as an AI community?
Yeah, absolutely. So due to time constraints, like you said, we can do a whole conference on that, on the issues and AI principles, and overlay those on the impact. However, I'm just going to touch on a few, and want to start with privacy. It's not worth noting that UN High Commissioner for Refugees aims to have all refugee biometric data from across the world in a central registry, in a central digital registry. This registry incorporates AI, blockchain, and biometric technology, and the aims is to save money, to create efficiencies, to provide ID portability when refugees are moving or displaced people are moving across borders, as well as fraud detection. These systems are built with private partnerships because a lot of the time the humanitarian agencies do not have the in-house capabilities or the infrastructure to provide this. So these technologies, as we all know, we've been discussing it for years. They're still controversial in terms of their accuracy, security, and vulnerability. However, they are piloted and experimented in different refugee camps. For example, under the WAIE and building blocks under World Food Program, refugees are required to provide their iris biometrics to access food to access their food aid in the refugee camps. This might be with the best of intentions. However, when an individual's access to aid is conditional on providing data, that totally diminishes their consent, any fairness, or any option for choice. In addition, like I said, there are private companies involved in this, and although the agency itself is a supranational organization, when you're moving across borders, the data can be and is shared with governments and private companies. So there is actually at the moment no publicly available agreements, no transparency on which data governments and private companies, and the big ones that are involved in this are Palantir, Google, and Facebook. We don't know what they can access and how they can use this data. So switching to another principle around bias, another principle on AI ethics, bias. Now, we're all too familiar with the issues of bias in general and providing techno solutions. One example was welfare eligibility decisions can be a parallel application that is done in the States. Similar to welfare eligibility determinations, refugee claims are very nuanced and complex. These are prone to be lost. These nuances and complexity are prone to be lost on automated decision-making systems determining eligibility. They can lead to bias, they can lead to discrimination. Here we're seeing yet another try to provide a techno solution to a highly social and political issue. As Branka mentioned, false negatives and false positives can lead to a person's legal status being incorrectly determined, a community not receiving aid or correct aid for that matter, or a person being placed in way of danger. So we're talking about some really life or death situations here. Branka, you want to talk about the human rights aspect on this?
Yes, exactly. So you see now the complexity of all of these problems in general when we talk about bias and privacy, and then especially when we look through the lens of refugees and what are all of the challenges that they are facing. And then on top of that, we wanted to mention another one, and that is safety and security, and the need of this human rights approach in tackling any problems or any solutions that we are trying to apply in tackling these problems. So for refugees fleeing war and persecution, they're already in a vulnerable position, right? So their country of origin does not give them a necessary protection, and often it happens that their own governments are actually persecuting them. So to apply for asylum, and Merve already mentioned some of these elements, so refugees need to provide some personal data, including sometimes very sensitive data and information about some of the experiences they went through surviving sexual violence or torture, because they're often fleeing wars they're experiencing, and sharing information about war crimes or crimes against humanity. So there are huge risks about data security breaches, and huge risks of their data being used for discrimination or even repatriation, resettlement, or a further persecution. So when we talk about protecting individuals' data in case of refugees, that means not only protecting their privacy, which is extremely important, but in some cases directly protecting their safety and security, and sometimes even their physical lives. So looking at all of these complexities and all of the levels and AI principles that we need to pay attention to, like bias, privacy, security, and safety, Merve and I wanted to also take some time here and to call this community of not only women in AI ethics, but in general, both AI practitioners, but humanitarian actors as well. We wanted to call them for action. So Merve, you want to start?
Yes, I do. So the first action, our call to action is vulnerable communities should not be test beds or testing sites. Technologies that would never be applied or would not be allowed in places like EU or US due to legal or regulatory barriers must not be applied for piloting capacity through humanitarian action. And we should really keep the big technology companies as well as governments accountable and being transparent about what they do with the data.
Absolutely, and I think this accountability is a huge issue and huge question, especially for this community, not only for big tech companies, but also governments who are applying these solutions, or even humanitarian actors. I personally think that because humanitarians are there to provide the help, they should also be accountable for their actions, especially now seeing how more and more we are also applying algorithms or new technologies to tackle some of these problems. So having this in mind, I just wanted to remind this community that there is a decade-long body of, or even longer body of knowledge of ethical principles in humanitarian work that need to be connected to AI work. So AI principles can be applied in isolation of this body of knowledge, and this is why we are calling for action to extend in a way the concept of human in the loop with humanitarian in the loop, and maybe even a refugee in the loop. So even including communities as refugees and have their participation in ethical considerations and ethical design, development, and application of AI solutions.
Absolutely, Branka. And I would like to add one more call to action towards that. International Organization for Migration, IOM, and Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics Group, DSEC, in partnership with a number of contributors, have published an initial framework for the ethical use of data systems in the humanitarian sector. This framework spotlights the issues that, and will soon publish a decision tree for responsible AI for field workers. But to your point, we can talk about every single ethical AI principle that we discuss in other contexts. And there's always a special consideration for the vulnerable communities within that.